So welcome to our panel on democratic ways of life in an age of polarization. It may be fortunate that we reflect on such questions the day after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. Her life bears witness to how central feminists have been for the struggle for democracy. May her memory be a blessing. My name is Til van Rahden, and I'm honored to chair such a distinguished group of panelists: Paula Diehl, Claus Leggewie, and Jason Mast. Like Caesar's Gaul, our panel is divided into three parts. First, our panelists will offer an opening statement. Then they will have the opportunity to briefly respond to each other's arguments. And finally, in the spirit of democracy, we will open the discussion for comments and questions from the audience in the room and in the World Wide Web. The conference conveners have asked me to introduce the theme of the panel before I say a few words about our panelists. This panel is a continuation of the first on popular culture. To speak of democratic ways of life is to draw our attention to democratic experiences in everyday life. Democratic theory is often concerned with how democracy works. This panel focuses on what democracy feels like. Why is this a timely question? After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many came to see democracy as the default system of government in a modern society. Once post-communist countries had embraced liberal democracy, it would resemble a perpetual motion machine, a clearly defined model of government that could be exported anywhere. Its history and fragility, therefore, merited little attention. If we are all Democrats now, we have lost sight of the banality that liberal democracy is inherently fragile. And I quote, "There is no great share of probity necessary to support a monarchical or despotic government," Montesquieu noted in The Spirit of the Laws. Quote, "The force of laws in one, the divine rights of kings, and the prince's arm, brute force, in the other, are sufficient to direct and maintain the whole. But in a popular state, one spring more is necessary, namely virtue." Such a nod to Montesquieu may be relevant today when most studies on democracy revolve around the question how democracies degenerate and die. Once we acknowledge that democracy is fragile, we can cultivate a level-headed prudence rather than fueling a sense of despair. Instead of obsessing about how democracies die, it might prove more useful to explore what keeps them alive. Highlighting the fragility of democracy draws attention to a set of simple questions. What are the cultural preconditions that make democracy possible? What happens when we translate the seemingly outdated concept of virtue into a language of a democratic ethos, a democratic posture, a democratic mindset? Such questions are elusive. If one surveys decades of scholarship on civic culture, many studies end up focusing on democratic norms and a moral consensus as the foundation of a democracy. In the case of Germany, the famous Leitkultur. By speaking of democracy as a way of life, we respond to the concern that an emphasis on a democratic consensus is more problematic than usually assumed. Conversations about the role of forms for democracy as a way of life may contribute to a more subtle understanding of democracy's preconditions. To emphasize form over substance helps to allay contemporary anxieties about the moral basis of democracy. More importantly, questions of form help us redirect our conversation about polarization in public life. Our panel, therefore, is indebted to a strand in political thinking that views democracy as a way of life. We draw on the ideas of pragmatist thinkers such as Jane Addams, John Dewey, or Sidney Hook, as well as those of transcendentalists such as Walt Whitman. All of these, of course, are American thinkers. Whatever its past and present shortcomings, the intellectual life of the American Republic has proved a much more fertile ground for such controversies than Europe. Yet similar ideas have been part of transatlantic conversations and misunderstandings since Tocqueville. Theodor Heuss first used the phrase Demokratie als Lebensform in 1919, and it was central to his tenure as president of the Bonn Republic. Or take this interpretation of the democratic way of life from the 1950s, the halcyon days of transatlantic exchanges, and I quote, "The parent-child relationship may be based on autocratic or democratic principles. Democratic education stimulates independent action and judgment. An effort is made to reach agreement and understanding by explanation. The democratic parent aims to render himself superfluous as soon as possible, to bring up a free and responsible individual capable of taking his fate into his own hands." What sounds like John Dewey from New York is Alf Ross from Copenhagen, a leading legal theorist of his time. By the time the term of Lebensformen entered the vocabulary of modern philosophy, it had become a halfway house between a fully developed moral or ethical idea and an unconscious routine in our daily lives, as in Wittgenstein's analogy between language, games, and forms of life. The concept of Lebensform offers a language of weak normativity that allows us to explore questions of moral history while avoiding strong moral judgments that languages of values and norms draw upon. In short, forms, not norms, are crucial here. Those who view cultural homogeneity as a prerequisite for liberal democracy overlook the fact that a specifically democratic form of sociability emerges not from harmony, but rather from discord and strife, perhaps even polarization. Our ability to accept moral dilemmas that we cannot solve, but only navigate, presupposes forms that allow us to live with deep pluralism. Reflections on ways of life, questions of style and democratic spaces allow us to hone our feel for the cultural foundations of democracy. No matter how stable a democratic constitutional order may seem, without ways of life that allow for democratic experiences, it will wither and perish. If democracy requires that citizens cultivate a democratic ethos in quotidian encounters, this presupposes a democratic commons, cultural forms and social spaces that offer everyone the chance to experience freedom and equality in everyday life. In short, to explore democracy as a way of life is to focus not on how democracy works, but what it feels like. All three panelists are in an ideal position to discuss the question of democratic ways of life in an age of polarization. Paula Diehl, to my right, holds the chair of political theory, history of ideas, and political culture in Kiel. Her work on populism, the political imaginary, and political symbolism has helped define one of the most vibrant areas of democratic theory. She has held prestigious fellowships, including a Dilthey Fellowship and a fellowship from the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. Her publications include the widely acclaimed monographs Macht, Mythos, Utopie, die Körperbilder der SS-Männer 2005, das Symbolische, das Imaginäre und die Demokratie, eine Theorie politischer Repräsentation 2015. Recently, she contributed an essay on Populist Twist, the relationship between the leader and the people in populism, to the volume Creating Political Presence, the New Politics of Democratic Representation, University of Chicago Press 2019, a book that assembles essays by leading political theorists of our time. After a distinguished career as a political scientist, Claus Leggewie now holds the Ludwig Börne Chair at the University of Gießen. From 2007 to 2015, he was director of the Kulturwissenschaftliche Institut in Essen and the Center for Global Cooperation Research in Duisburg. He has held fellowships at world-renowned institutes for advanced studies, such as the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, the Remarque Institute in New York, and the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. Most importantly, Claus Leggewie is a citizen scholar par excellence who has an uncanny ability to address the larger public as well as academic peers. His recent publications include Jetzt, Opposition, Protest, Widerstand, 2019, Less Frightening, Die Konsultative, Mehr Demokratie durch Bürgerbeteiligung, 2018, and Europa zuerst, eine Unabhängigkeitserklärung, 2017. Jason, sitting in the middle, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Research Center Normative Orders. He is an internationally renowned political sociologist. His current work analyzes populism, ethno-nationalism, and isolationism. Taken together, these movements in North America and Europe have upended neoliberal and multicultural certainties, he argues. His publications include The Performative Presidency, Crisis and Resurrection During the Clinton Years, Cambridge UP 2013, and Politics of Meaning, Meaning of Politics, Cultural Sociology of the 2016 US Presidential Election, Palgrave Macmillan 2019, a volume he co-edited with Jeffrey Alexander. Most recently, he published an essay in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology with a most charming title, and I quote, Representationalism and Cognitive Culturalism, Riders on Elephants, on Turtles, all the way down. So please join me in welcoming the three panelists. Paula Diehl will go first.
Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I really like the setting that you put together in the conference, especially including the popular culture in the first section that we had today. And thank you, Till, for your very generous presentation of my biography. When I got the invitation to prepare something on polarization here, the first thing that came to my mind was well, actually there is another process going on, or another dynamic going on, which is more closely to describe as a normalization of anti-democratic or right-wing extremist ideas. And what I want to do today is try to think both that at the first glance, it seems a kind of contradiction to think about polarization and normalization, but I guess they are intricated, maybe in different ways, in different political cultures, but it seems to me that both mechanisms have to be thinking together. So if you look worldwide to the protests against racism and police violence, but also at right-wing extremist terror attacks, or the increasing symbolic violence and threats in social media, we can really confirm the impression that we have an increasing process of polarization, and not only in the USA, but maybe worldwide. this process of polarization is interesting for political culture because it can cause a fissure in society and political culture by structuring the political thinking in two camps, the foe and the friend, and then you have a huge problem for democracy because you cannot talk to each other. And in this situation, you cannot have a democratic living anymore. On the other hand, I would like to pay attention to the process of normalization, which is a kind of double process. On the one hand, it is a process of an normalization of polarized style that we can see all over the mass media culture. And on the other hand, there are a kind of increasing acceptance to ideas coming from the extreme right that a couple of years ago were impossible to be thinking in a frame of democratic public sphere. I would like to go through three aspects today. So the first one will be very, very briefly polarization. The second one, I would like to touch the role of right-wing populism in this transformation of political culture. And my argument here is that right-wing populists are not only agents of polarization, but also promotes normalization of right-wing extremist ideas. And then at the end, I will come back to the process of normalization and think about populist polarizing style and anti-democratic contests. So first to the polarization, I think two countries are particularly good example for thinking about the polarization in political culture, which are the USA right now and Brazil. And you still have these pictures in mind during the Black Matter protests, these burning cities, and the other picture will be the couple in St. Louis pointing guns to peaceful protesters. These both pictures bring us to the idea that maybe there is something going on in this society and in this political culture that can be a threat for democracy, in the sense that both parts are less and less speaking to each other. In Brazil, political violence, and now I'm linking political polarization to political violence in both countries. In Brazil, political violence among citizens is a very recent phenomenon. Brazilian is a very, very violent country. But until 2018, this violence was not linked to politics. And with the presidential race in 2018, there is something that was never been seen before, citizens attacking each other physically because of their political preferences at the streets, in bars, and restaurants sometimes. And this is not a phenomenon of one class, but across all the society. There are 28 citizens killed by this kind of violence in 2018, and 122 assassinations of politicians, including Bolsonaro, the president, were victim of a knife attack. So against this background, it is not difficult to recognize a polarizing process of political culture, maybe even in a global dimension. And in both countries, the presidents in 2018 in Brazil was a candidate, but the presidents were most important performative vectors of polarization. They endorse violence and employ right-wing populist rhetoric. This brings me to the role of right-wing populists today. So populism is well known for promoting polarization. Populism oversimplifies political issues and transform all gray shadows of political questions into black and white rhetoric. it increases emotionalization and dramatizes political issues and conflicts. And more importantly, it makes a moral division of society between friend and foe. In so doing, populist actors work as promoters of polarization. And here it's just a general mechanism of populism, not necessarily linked to right-wing populism. The problem of populism is that it poses a trap for other political actors, since it has some affinities to the media logic, and it's very compatible to the way mass media select and present issues. So if you have a populist actor competing with other actors who are not populist, this actor will be probably privileged by mass media. The effect is that the polarization as a style becomes more and more present in mass media, and it forces the other competitors for media attention to change their political communication. When you have populists coming from the right, and that's what we call right-wing populism, which is a mixture of populism and right-wing ideology, right-wing extremist ideology. It's important to correct here. You have a complex situation because you have the introduction of ideas coming from the extreme and anti-democratic spectrum mixed with populism. And what you have at this point is, if populism positions itself within democracy, right-wing extremist ideas are outside of democracy. Putting both together, you have a kind of new positioning of right-wing extremist ideas within populism. They become more ambivalent, more ambiguous, but at the same time, they can pass through the barriers that will block anti-democratic thinking to be a kind of mainstream in public sphere. So you have a kind of way to have right-wing ideas, right-wing extremist ideas being more and more repeated in public sphere. The point here is you have the populist, right-wing populist acting as a double agent. The first the first way they are working in the public sphere is they are promoting polarization styles because they are populists and they are using the populist rhetoric. But on the other hand, they are also generating a normalization of ideas which were not a part of public sphere when public sphere were democratically framed. So what you have here is a kind of repetition of ideas which are anti-democratic because they exclude minorities, they privilege groups, and they sometimes are authoritarian. They are passing through this barrier in public sphere because they are combined with populism. So in this sense, you have a kind of repetition by mass media, and because you have a competition for media attention, you have the risk that also other competitors take up not only in the populist style, but also in the right-wing extremist ideas. So now I'm coming to normalization because I think I don't have so much time. So normalization can be understood as rendering something normal in very simple thinking. And I want to say that Ruth Wodak used the concept of normalization for the description of a process that changes the perception of what is normal and what is not. We can talk about normalization when marginalized discourses and demands migrate from the periphery into the middle of society and are defended by established parties. And that's why I mentioned before the right-wing populist actors as a catalyst for this kind of normalization. What is considered to be normal changes all time and is a product of political struggle. Normalization is this process of change. The point is that overexposition and repetition make the audience used to what is repeated. We can talk about the normalization of anti-democratic ideas that does not necessarily needs to be consciously. As agent of right-wing extremist ideas, even in an ambivalent way, right-wing populists performatively said ideas that were unacceptable in the public sphere before. Observing the German case or the German political debate since the controversy around Thilo Sarrazin's book Deutschland schafft sich ab, it is possible to detect a process of adaptation by mass media makers and by political actors from the whole ideological spectrum to the right-wing populist rhetoric. The mechanism was very well studied in Austria, and again, Ruth Woder did it very well, and she could show how ideas from the right-wing extremist groups, which were not known by the public sphere, what promoted by the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, in a very soft way, and they could navigate between all other competitors, turning into a kind of acceptable way to see democracy. The Austrian case shows that right-wing extremist ideologies that used to occupy a marginal and external position facing democratic public sphere become acceptable and normalized after they were combined with populism. I did not mention many crucial aspects connected to polarization and normalization, such as influence of games culture, reality TV, celebrity, social media, and politainment. But I'm glad that this was included in a conference, and maybe we can discuss this aspect in the general discussion. I think that polarization and normalization of right-wing ideas are not intricated in the same way in every places. If you look at Germany and US, Germany, France, and Austria on the one hand, and USA and Brazil on the other hand, you see very strong differences between both. Just to make it short, in Austria and Germany, for example, normalization seems to affect the whole political spectrum and political culture, while in the US and in Brazil, it seems to affect only conservatives. But that's with a big question mark here. I would like to finish my reflection on the topic with a question to the specialists on American culture, US American culture, if it's true, or if you can see signs of normalization of right-wing extremist ideas also among other milieux than only conservatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Claus Leggewie.
Yeah, thank you and good afternoon. Our former Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, is quoted with a statement. He said he would like a political culture back in which there are opponents but no enemies. Who would not agree? It has become a commonplace that we lived in an era of polarization that threatens democracy. A number of recent incidents and observations may affirm this. Public debates and appearances are being cancelled and threatened. Hate speech and declarations of enmity are increasing in an inflationary manner. Civil war scenarios are being issued in the United States, and militant battles are being fought in the streets and squares. The consensus on basic assumptions about rational conflict management and trust in the performance of representative democracy have also dwindled. Public, but even private and family conversations are characterized by mistrust and a refusal to enter into the deliberation of conflicting opinions and worldviews. Call this the convey phenomena. The compromise, the backbone and touchstone of democracy has fallen into disrepute. Fundamentalisms of all kinds are gaining ground, a paranoid style of politics the trademark Richard Hofstadter had coined for McCarthyism of the 1950s, is booming. So this is the general mood, but it needs some qualifications. First, one has to admit that conflict per se does not endanger democracy. It is rather its foundation. Social change is triggered by civic and institutional dispute resolution. And in real-life politics, things never go unemotional. Feelings play a crucial role that has long been underestimated or denied in political science. That includes strong aversions, hostile feelings, which only then become a problem when they harden into an insurmountable polarization that is inaccessible to arguments and often corresponds with group-related enmity, especially anti-Semitism. Does this affect party systems still seen at the backbone of political participation? Please allow me a brief reminiscence. The first political science text that I personally came across and to read was Otto Kirchheimer's essay on so-called catch-all parties, in German Allerwelts- und Volksparteien. In 1965, when the article was published in Politische Vierteljahresschrift, Kirchheimer, a famous constitutional lawyer who had to go to exile in 1937, projected the alleged convergence of US Democrats and Republicans onto the Western European political party system, which was supposed to move away from ideologically solidified milieus and denominations into a more pragmatic and short-time choice too. Lines of divisions between labor and capital, the rich and the poor, translated into the political poles of left and right, he thought would flatten out, and the parties, in Kirchheimer's view, most just two of them, a two-party system, would use almost identical programs and platforms and slogans taken from an advertisement to attract voters of all milieus. Party research has in some cases vehemently contradicted this and has diagnosed a trend towards more diversity and specialization, particularly in Western European political systems, where new cleavages emerged indeed, in particular the green option and right-wing radicalism. The irony, however, is that in the US, of all places, polarization has increased and intensified extremely since the mid-60s, from Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush, not to forget dubious figures like Newt Gingrich. With them, Republican voters drifted more and more to the right. Based in relatively homogeneous middle-class milieus, the two parties that are both more or less right-wing by European standards, two parties have ignited a cultural war that is now driven by white evangelicals, taking full shape in the Trump era or in the era of the current president. And Republicans, formerly a bastion of libertarianism and tax reductions for the super-rich, switched more and more to the endorsement of white supremacy, racism, sexism, and religious bigotry. The question is then, how did the US become such a polarized society and political system? Was this the effect of the growing social inequality, or the effect of demography, the fear of white people to be marginalized in the not so long run? Researchers nowadays recognize Kirchheimer's anxiety about modern democracy. It originated with what he saw as the vanishing of principled opposition within parliament and society and the reduction of politics to the mere management of the state. This leads to collusion of political parties and the state, to severing of the societal links of party organizations, and to erosion of the classic separation of powers. Vanishing opposition, cartelization, and professionalization of politics pits citizens against a powerful state, and this is one of the reasons for populist revolt, which increases political cynicism and apathy. But a real antidote would presuppose a return to democratic principles which have been given up creepingly, particularly by the GOP since the mid-90s. Nevertheless, I would hold that the thesis of a general polarization of democratic communities is rather misleading. It implies a kind of parallelogram of forces in which two antagonistic parties jointly steer away from the supposed consensual center into extreme opposite directions. And furthermore, that they share a common responsibility for this. Such a movement cannot be discovered on the liberal, even radical left side. What we see instead is a rather one-sided attack of the political right against democracy as a form of rule and as a form of life, and against its representatives and elites in general. It obviously took us a while to realize this. The extreme right is neither a bunch of disillusionist people striving to be heard in their pains, like Nancy Rosenberg's White Trash or Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land or G.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, nor a basket of deplorables who don't know what to do and what they do. The right-wing polarizers, mostly affluent middle and upper-class people, consciously attack the liberal institutions, the separation of powers, the rule of law, and the concept of representation itself, and all the habits and customs of parliamentary rule. In the end, they definitely want to abolish all this and convert it into a plebiscitary autocratic system with strongmen at the top. And they do not strive for a fair dialogue with us, with liberals. They simply despise and hate an assembly of ours like this one. Germans tend to the horseshoe theory. Horseshoe theory. German Hufeisentheory. Hufeisentheory. Both extremes touch at the end. With a supposed common fight of the two extremist camps against the center. This is our Weimar syndrome. It fails to discover the extremism of the center itself. The supposed shared responsibility for the failure of the First Republic, of the National Socialists on the one hand and the Communists on the other hand, was transferred into the political architecture of the Second Republic in the so-called extremism theory, extremismus theory. I come to the end. Liberals have been blamed for the alienation of working class people from democracy. This comes down to a painful and paralyzing left liberal cleavage. Everywhere, including and now in the US, the democratic camp itself is torn between offering a radical progressive counter-program on the one hand, look at Bernie Sanders or AOC, or creating a refuge in the center for conservatives worried that the slide into authoritarianism has gone too far on the other hand. The dilemma is that while conformism is an unsafe option, there is generally no broad support for a radical break. Because majorities are easier to obtain with appeals to bread and butter concerns in the hinterlands than by cultivating ideological and cultural differences and preferences in urban centers, the opposition seems like trying to square the circle. My conclusion may seem very disappointing and contradictory to you. It is not the liberals or the radical left, it's the conservative Democrats who may not be tempted any longer to join or even ally with radical right-wingers, who bear the responsibility for the sustainability of liberal democracies. Ultimately, the survival of democracy, and that's what it is about now, depends on the political right's ability to self-reflect and to change direction. Like a century ago, conservatives stand at a crossroads, heading either towards open authoritarianism or even fascism, or reconciliation with liberal modernity. Christian Democrats in Europe and South America took the latter step in 1945 in reaction to immense catastrophes. After the Second World War, mechanisms of concordance were built into the political systems in order to involve the greatest possible number of political actors. At this time, this mainly had to do with national welfare states, a scale that has become too narrow now in view of the planetary challenge of environmental crisis. At the end, the formation of a new cleavage, either par force de choses or by inventive politics and parties, is on the table. To use the somewhat prepotent but clairvoyant slogan of the early Greens in the 70s, neither left nor right up front.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist is Jason Mast.
Yes, so thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here, and it's interesting how the panel is coming together. I think we're going to have maybe 3 distinct orientations to this same subject, so it'll, I'm sure it's going to be interesting in the discussion. When I approach this question of polarization and the democratic way of life, my imagination immediately went to the notion of civil society or the civil sphere, because that's where I think that most citizens experience their democratic identity, their feelings of being part of a collective, something greater than themselves, and then also caring, strongly about what's going to happen with that community. And so I want to talk about polarization and the democratic way of life in terms of the civil society, or what I'll also call the civil sphere. And I use these relatively interchangeably, so don't get tripped up if I switch back and forth. So at the risk of just getting a little bit abstract at the beginning, I want to introduce a model, a way of thinking about the relationship between the civil sphere and other parts of our lives, and other parts of a complex, highly differentiated social organization, like Germany. You think about a national culture, a national society, the United States. Well, the civil sphere, right? So we'll just think of like circles drawn on a blackboard. The civil sphere would just be one sphere, one circle in that drawing, okay? And then other circles around that circle would be things like gender or the family. In classic, civil society literature, we talked about the state or the economy. These would be circles that we want to be outside of the civil sphere because we don't want them to dominate the civil sphere. Okay, so in these highly complex and highly differentiated social organizations, we have race, we have ethnicity, we have sexuality. All of these things are aspects of our individual identities. We all fit into each of these categories. Not all of them, but some of them. Okay, the ideal of democratic life and how the civil sphere works to sustain it is that when we enter into that as citizens of this community, is that we're supposed to, in some ways, reduce our identification with these particular non-civil sphere identities and think of ourselves as citizens sharing participation and solidarity with those who are different than us. We're similar in some regards in civil terms and dissimilar in these other. Okay. So the main thing that I want to emphasize, and hopefully I'm going to flesh this out empirically, in a minute or two, is that the civil sphere, access to it, inclusion in it, the ability to participate in it and not get shut down or shut up or told to leave, is that you demonstrate a capacity for ideal forms of citizenship. Okay, and these are culturally constructed, they're culturally specific, but they're also cultural manifestations of the universal. Okay, that means that any human is in theory capable of embodying those characteristics. They can be rational and active and autonomous, right? They're free of coercion. They're able to think, wear the veil of ignorance, so to speak. So those are the criteria of the ideal form of citizenship. If you can demonstrate those capacities, that you can act that way, then you should be included. That's the theory, okay? The non-civil spheres, right, they have their own inequalities and hierarchies and forms of domination. And those they're legitimate. And they're legitimized based on very specific forms of criteria of inclusion. So in the economic world, if you have much more money than somebody else and you use your power to take what this other person wanted, that's legitimate, right? That's a form of the use of power that in the economic sphere is generally considered legitimate. You have to have particular biological or you could say cultural sexual repertoires to belong to a certain gender sphere. The family sphere, for instance, there is typically, traditionally, a hierarchy built into it based on, the parents are going to be able to tell the children what to do and not do without their power being challenged as illegitimate. Okay, so you have your non-civil spheres, you have your civil sphere. Okay. Real civil societies, of course, the real civil spheres are not just composed of people who have demonstrated the positive cultural capacities of being a good democratic citizen. That's the ideal. That's the evaluative criteria by which we judge each other. We say, yes, that person should be included, or that group of people should be included because they have demonstrated that they have these ideal capacities. So real civil societies are inhabited, they bear the legacies of their histories, okay? So in the United States case, we have the history of slavery, we have a history of sequestrating women into the private realm as opposed to the men, where the public realm was for the men. And then over time, of course, there's been successful movements, partially successful movements, that have changed the boundaries of civil society so that they were expanded so that formerly marginalized groups were able to gain some dimensions of inclusion. And when they've had inclusion, they've been able to have a voice. And it's not only about communicating ideas and political desires, it's also about, I want to emphasize the phenomenological component. It's about a feeling. It's about feeling like you're included and that you belong there, and that you're respected to some basic degree. You're not intimidated. You're not easily shut down. Okay. So when we come to the 2016 and the 2020 American presidential elections, American presidential campaigns, these are dramas about the meaning and the identity of the American civil sphere. These are stories about what should that community, which characteristics should it champion? Which types of people should it allow in and allow to have the sort of the hegemonic voice? Okay, and so if we look at 2016, it becomes clear that this was a competition between one campaign under the slogan of Stronger Together. And that slogan suggests a continuation of the expansion of the civil sphere to include more and more formerly excluded identities. The counter narrative was Make America Great Again. And this was a narrative about, in order for this community to survive, we have to regain control of the civil sphere, raise its barriers, contract them, and expel identities that have gained entry within the last 10, 20, 30 years. Okay? So to me, when we're talking about polarization and the democratic way of life, polarization, I don't have my glasses on, so. Polarization, to me, this is the heartbeat of democracy. There is going to be, we're going to move from periods of polarization to some sort of reduction of it to, it's about backlash and frontlash. So again, to use these civil sphere terms, frontlash is the term I use to describe when, now this is typically associated with the American left, where the universalistic discourse becomes predominant, becomes widely popular. We can see of the rise of multiculturalism and its ascendancy, and really, I mean, to use this, it's almost its domination of Americans' understandings of legitimate membership in the civil society, a normalization of difference. Multiculturalism said, your differences of your particular identities do not preclude you from embodying the universalistic criteria that this community values and thinks are necessary for the practice of being a good democratic citizen. Okay, so what we're experiencing now is, of course, backlash. We've witnessed a decade plus of, really exceptional instances of successful frontlash. We can go through marriage. Okay, so we could say that what there's been is destabilization of classifications within the non-civil spheres. So gender fluidity, here's a good example of this is much more normalized and accepted, and the notion of a non-binary gender identity has increasingly been interpreted as not threatening and not polluting. It doesn't preclude you from being a good democratic citizen. Therefore, if you have a non-binary gender identity, we can no longer legitimately be excluded. Okay, so you see that would be an example of how the civil criteria has forced changes in a non-civil sphere. That's where you get backlash. And then you look, we can come up with 10 or 15 good examples of that. And over the past 10 to 20 years, what I wanted to say is that contemporary polarization is a right-wing backlash against civil triumphs, an expansion of the civil sphere to include more types, more people, and civil intrusions into non-civil spheres. The use of universalistic criteria in things, we were talking about the film industry. In this industry, a non-civil sphere, what is the source of critique for white, male-dominated film production, for American hegemonic production? This is the discourse of civil society saying the inequalities, the forms, the ways that you legitimate yourself in that sphere are no longer, we're no longer going to treat those as legitimate. That is a civil discourse intruding on, so an example, okay. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I'd like to highlight one thing that I think is central to particularly the European conversation, and then maybe raise two questions. So the first is to pick up on Claus Leggewie's observation about conservatism in post-war Europe. I think at the heart of the democratic miracle in post-war Europe is the fact that the very political traditions that had actively destroyed liberal democracy in the 20s and 30s embraced liberal modernity, as you put it, and was central to building that kind of democratic constitutionalism with a sort of Christian democratic flavor and tinge that you may or may not like. But I think this is central, and I think it is something worth keeping in mind as we see the erosion of that, shall I say, conservative embrace of liberal democracy. The question that I have, so the first is, I think, how useful would it be to distinguish carefully between polarization on the one hand, in which both ends of the political spectrum obviously share part of the burden, and then we know all the keywords, echo chambers, filter bubbles, etc., etc., and distinguish that from a genuine shift to the right, where the whole political spectrum moves to the right. And finally then, the category that Jason brought up, the category of the backlash, which also strikes me as something that's not it's not identical to what we call polarization. And the next question that I'm sure many in the audience will also have, and so perhaps we will return to it again, is the whole question of conflict and strife. Particularly in the post-war German context, we have long lived with the fantasy that democratic public life is about a consensus. But the compromise is not about consensus. It is a way of navigating aversion and conflict. And every compromise, therefore, is only temporary. And in a couple of years, we will revisit that very compromise. But if that is the case, if conflict and strife, aversion, in some cases even enmity, are central to democratic politics, what is it that allows us to make sure that that enmity, that strife, that conflict doesn't end up in violence and civil war? And I think that is the key question that a democratic theory that focuses on conflict and strife needs to respond to. And now you're free to respond in any way you want. Paula, you want to go first?
Well, there's just one word, it's education. It's political cultural education. You need to educate. You need to be a good citizen, as you pointed it out. You need to be educated. You need to be trained. You need to be coached. You need to be decent. You need to be demütig, I don't know the English word, and to accept the position of others without taking them as your position. We were just discussing during the break, there's a video available on YouTube showing in 1965 a debate between James Baldwin, then the leader of, if you like, the black resurgence and movement, very close to radical blacks in the United States, and William F. Buckley, the standard bearer of the extreme right, the predecessor of everything you don't like about the American right. So these two people go to Cambridge and discuss in a very decent way. You can look at this, it's available on YouTube, and you see how two people who are adversaries, who have their aversions, very strong aversions, they have very different positions, and they hold to their positions, and they point them out, and they fight each other, and how they discuss. And the format in Cambridge is exactly political education. There are two undergraduates who introduce these two people and who very decently and very self-consciously say, well, this is my position. The question, by the way, was, does the Negro contribute to the American dream? That would be, as a title, would even be impossible in these days. Yeah, there is the N-word, but this was the question, if you like, a completely impossible question to answer. But what I was like to point out is that is an experiment in political education, to be very modest in form. This is about forms, and very strong and aversive, if you like, and antagonistic in your positions about what you think is the best thing for the community.
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, I think it's a very good, what Claus Leggewie already mentioned, it's a very good example for what happens when styles of discussion have been polarized and what happened before. So I'm not so sure if education is the only way. I have my doubts. I think the problem is maybe deeper. We have a lack on vision of community as a whole. And this lack of the vision of a community has been filled up by right-wing populists. So what we need here is more than just to be educated to participate in a frame without this kind of polarization, but a frame where everybody can interact with each other without this kind of aggressive rhetoric and political symbolical violence. But I think we need already a way to think about democracy when we can be the people, the ideal people. So we don't need to be the same, but we need a kind of vision that we can share. And that has a lot to do with the crisis of political parties. They are not offering visions of what it can share. And those who are doing that are the anti-democratic. So we need more performative statements, more visions, also in the public sphere, and using mass media for it.
I mean, I agree that education is important. If we look at, you know, some of the poll results, the exit polls from the last American election, one of the biggest dividing lines was some sort of amount of exposure to college education. So this clearly, in my mind, shapes a sort of political, if not civil, consciousness that has, you know, penetrated a remarkable degree of the American populace, and obviously not all of it. Nonetheless, I also agree, and I think that this comes back with what Paula is saying is an interesting difference between the German or European model and the American model. Americans have very weak parties, especially changes made in the wake of the late 60s, early 70s. The party leadership has very even less control today and less of an ability to impose a certain sort of vision on its constituency. But this is, if we come back to democracy as a way of life, one of the virtues of the American, you know, we talked about it as reality TV in the prior session, about the overly dramatic, it seems so irrational and highly stylized. And it goes on forever. There's characters and bizarre stories that, you know, they may develop and be important at the beginning, and then they're not even part of, they're gone in 6 months, and the election is about something entirely different 8 months later. They are full-fledged dramas. And one of the positive things about that is that it allows marginalized people who normatively should be marginalized, but they can have candidates, spokesmen, representatives that go before the public and pitch their narrative, and then they can at least have some sort of dimension of feeling like my worldview has been represented. It's been, you know, ignored or criticized and shut down, but that the sort of highly, you know, the carnivalesque nature of the American system allows, you could say, you know, where you let steam out of you let some air out of the, you know, it's a catharsis. It's a release of. Now, the main thing about that is there's no guarantee. As we saw in 2016, one of those figures can win, and then control. That is very dangerous. So that's the catch-22, right? That's where we're stuck with a representative popular democracy. Is that to allow these visions to have the stage and to espouse very, not only non-civil, but anti-civil visions, gives them a representation in the community. Therefore, the idea is still, I want to dominate that community, not leave it, right? It's when people start saying, I no longer want to save this community, I'm no longer invested in leading it and all of them, instead, I want to destroy it, or I want to lead from the outside. That's when you have an abandonment of the common community, that's when you see democracy, I think, really in danger.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to, since we're talking about debates on YouTube, I'm also a big fan of the Buckley-Baldwin debate. And you can, if you know some German, you can listen to Max Bense and Josef Beuys and Arnold Gehlen debating the political significance of art in 1964 or so, which is also an extraordinary example of people fundamentally disagreeing, being at each other's throats, but still accepting the other as a legitimate opponent. But as another example, you go to YouTube, Google Bautzen zurück zur Sache Debatte, and you will have a debate among 500 citizens of the city of Bautzen, where the AfD now controls the city parliament. And what you see is the sort of vicious, xenophobic extremism of the center. It is not some wacko right-wing extremists who go out to the B96 and wave Reichsbürgerflaggen, but it's respectable citizens from the city engaging in the vicious rhetoric that I haven't heard since the late 20s, early 30s, and that's obviously remarkable. The second is the question of education, and obviously the follow-up issue is what kind of education do we have in mind? So it can be any form of education, and not every form of education is going to be useful. The book that I was quoting from and bringing in the gentleman called Alf Ross, who's now completely forgotten, contains lots of articles about democracy and education, but also 2 articles on theater and cinema. So in that sense, there's a bridge between the first panel and this panel, because popular culture is a key site in which democratic subjectivities, a democratic ethos can be cultivated. Not necessarily, but possibly. Okay, with this in mind, I would like to throw the floor open for discussions from the floor. So please briefly identify yourself with your name, and then we take it from there.
Oh, hi. I am Devi Agostinho. I am from Brazil. Not only from Brazil, but I am a native Brazilian. I am Pythagorean. And then I would like just to know Professor Paula's view on one aspect of this whole shift that happened in Brazilian politics. We know that Brazil was not an important international player until 2002, and then with the election of Lula da Silva and the economical growth, we started to look at Brazil as an important international player. But then this freedom, this sense of freedom that this government brought, not only economic freedom, but real freedom, like with social justice, and also some sense that every citizen were important, the indigenous people, the black people, the LGBTQA+. It ended with Dilma Rousseff ousting in 2016 that the international community didn't really fully acknowledge as what it really was. That was a coup d'etat. And this, of course, has huge repercussions for what happens afterwards. But what I would like to emphasize is that, we had 500 years of colonization in Brazil, straight up, 13 years of freedom, and then now we go back to the conservative structures of power. And now it seems that it's different than it was before, because now we actually have something to compare to, these 13 years. And this, we only go back to this conservative ideology after we ousted, actually it was a coup d'etat, we ousted Dilma Rousseff in 2016. I would like to know your visions upon this specific, this specifically because, of course, these structures of power we know very well in Brazil. And it's only now that we can compare, and so they, of course, jump, and we can see then more clearly. But this violence and this conservative this conservative propaganda is there from the beginning, and in these 13 years we had something else. What is your views on the Dilma Rousseff's case? Because she was ousted, then it was proved again and again that was a coup d'etat. And this is my question, and thank you so much for your talk.
Oh, that's a very, very far question. I just start from the impeachment. The tragedy in this impeachment process was that you don't have what it should have been, well, the intention of the impeachment, a kind of moralization of politics. It doesn't happen. With the anti-corruption operation Lava Jato, what we could see is all the parties were engaged in corruption. But the problem is only the Workers' Party have been sanctioned by voters for being corrupted. The other parties didn't really suffer so much. And then you have a kind of organizing power with among very different groups. Behind the conservative forces, you have the evangelicals, which are new players in Brazilian situation, with a very conservative agenda, especially covering family issues and sexual orientations. And then you have the enterprise world organized as a neoliberal politics, and you have those who have the land, and you never have an agrarian reform in Brazil. So you have a very, very polarized social situation in the sense of who have and who have not. And Brazil is one of the countries that you have 4 or 5 classes for the economic counting, 5.
5 indivisible, that the people that don't even qualify as a social class.
Yes, so you have these classes that are not included. So what you can see in this situation is after the hope of the poor to be integrated in democracy has vanished. There is no other group promising to change it. So people are trying what they can. You have Bolsonaro coming out and say, so let's forget about democracy. I'm bringing you order. That's better. You'll have the right to defend yourself by your own gun. You'll have the right to have your own economy if you want. And if you are good, you will succeed. So that's the promise which is at stake on the economic point of view. And emotionally, this kind of protection is interesting because it has some fascist ways of connecting people. So you feel a kind of part of a very powerful group. And that's very seducing, especially for those who were discriminated from civil society and from the political process.
Yes, thank you very much for 3 excellent papers with very different perspectives, each of which was on its own terms very insightful. I want to briefly come back to Claus Leggewie's position on polarization, and particularly on your argument that polarization is really a category that is wrong-headed because what we're looking at is a radicalization that is happening on the right. I wonder if it wouldn't make sense to actually use the term polarization in a more flexible way, where we do not automatically assume that polarization has to be happening to the same extent on both sides, but that polarization makes sense as a category that can be asymmetrical. Where you have polarizing figures who are polarizing precisely in the sense that they set in place a dynamic that starts on one side, that is, in the case of the United States, clearly driven from the right, but that nonetheless creates a situation in which both sides become polarized in the sense of becoming more inclined to to sort of strengthening the consensus within itself rather than working towards a civil society that allows for agreement and conflict at the same time. Wouldn't it be possible to then hold on to the notion or to the category of polarization in a more meaningful and more flexible sense?
I totally agree. I mean, if you look what's happening in some places in the United States right now, or even in Eastern Germany, if you look at some happenings in Leipzig 2 weeks ago, then of course you have a radicalization or a polarization attempt on the other side too. But as a description or an analytical category for what's going on in our political systems and societies, I wouldn't take this so too serious, what's going on there. There is a reaction to it. Of course, there are people, the current president calls them Antifa. There are people who kind of prepare for this civil war that is initiated by Trump and his followers. And they could, in a way, be represented in an asymmetrical polarization scenario. But for a structural analysis of our societies, of what's going on, let's say the last 2 decades in terms of right-wing extremism and radicalism, I think this is incomplete. It always, like the horseshoe theory, the Hufeisentheorie in Germany, always has a certain kind of inbuilt symmetry. It has a kind of, there is this strong center holding against the extremes, which is not true, neither for the United States, or as we don't have Sirakovsky on this podium, who was unfortunately not able to come, he could describe this process in Poland and in Hungary. Of course, you could say that to talk about Hungary, that the success of the democratic success, by the way, democratically legitimated success of Viktor Orban by a certain polarization of the society. No, this is the attack of the right against the Hungarian constitution of the post-1990 consensus and against all kinds of democratic procedures and rituals and habits. So this is clear. I think we have to, I think this was also, we were agreeing on this point. There is this strong pressure from the right, and we should call it a strong pressure from the right and not talk in terms of polarization, which gives more legitimacy to those who polarize from the right.
Thank you for all your papers. Since we are here together in order to discuss similarities or dissimilarities among America, USA, and Europe, I would like to focus on the question whether or not the analyzed situation of polarization in civil societies and in the political spectrum is compared among America on the one side, or USA, and Europe, the same, or is it different, or in which respect it is different? So it might be interesting to come to something like a view or to compare both developments on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean.
It's not based on empirical research, so I'm very careful about it, but what I understood from people studying conservatives in the US, it looks like the process of normalization that I have described before, normalization of right-wing extremist ideas, occur among conservatives. And using the race discourse to create a kind of white blue-collar identity and create more resentments and in order to unify the conservatives. My question was, is this process only among conservatives, or can you see a spreading of styles and ideologies among other groups. I don't have an answer to it. In Germany or in Western Europe in general, it looks like the whole center has moved to the right. So we are now talking about a kind of polarization which is completely shift to the right. So even those who are trying to contest this movement are not really in the extreme left. You have some of these groups, but they are not so strong as we can imagine. So there is no real polarization in the sense that both sides are as strong as each other. I don't think so. But you have a polarization in the sense that the way they are interacting to each other is a polarized one, a way that you cannot agree in some common sense of how to discuss with each other, that you accept the other, and sometimes there are reasons for it. You cannot accept someone who is claiming to be against democracy in a democratic setting. So I think there is a kind of normalization in different ways and polarization in different ways, but I let the question open if you have it. The spreading of normalization of right-wing extremist ideologies also in the US. Yeah.
Tracy?
You know, my next project is, it's like you just wrote the proposal for it and your eloquent question. It's a comparative treatment of the prelude to the 2016 American election, the campaign that preceded the Brexit vote in the UK, and the prelude to the 2017 federal election in Germany. And my orientation to the question is to try to look at what I call structural interpretive foundations. To me, that's where the notion of an imagined national community is, that's how it's facilitated. Why do, with all these conflicting identities and interests, how do we still share an identity that transcends the particularities? And to me, the answer is that there are foundational myths, cultural codes, narratives that we all, to some extent, subscribe to, nationally bounded. And so my project will look at the destabilization of each of those three, you know, in the run-up to those elections. So I don't have the answer yet. I think it's a great question, though, because I will be working on it.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to your proposal that one of the main differences is, of course, religion. The religious factor is much more important in the US and in Brazil than in Europe until now. But on the other hand, there is a certain kind of globalization of these ideas. Identity politics is a global meme. Religious right-wing movements or evangelicalization is a global thing. So it's also very strong in Eastern Europe, for example. So on the one hand, you have strong national constituencies yeah, but there is a kind of globalization of the right wing going on, and that's why, for example, white supremacist theories or memes or conspiracy theories now are also booming in Europe. So this is not very European. There is a strong European anti-Semitism, racism, and colonialism, but it gets a certain American flavor, if you like, right now. And all these people, the right-wing terrorists, are simply using this, and they're using this in Halle as well as in Christchurch or in Boston. So I think there is a certain globalization going on, but it always keeps strong national ingredients.
If I may I do want to say that this is, I think, one of the reasons that it's so important for us to, feel strongly and care about the health of civil societies outside of our national identities, outside of our shorelines. Information technology clearly is a huge factor in this, but we look at each other's civil societies as symbolic representations of what we want or don't want. You know, we look at our state systems. These are, you know, powerful, evaluative symbols that we draw on in our own local national cultures to say, look, we can do better. Or, you know, to the contrary, no, we could look at what they're doing. We can also go back to much more restrictive models as well. So I just wanted to, reiterate the importance of this international context.
May I introduce just one small element? Well, it's not small, I think it's important, but which is a fragmentation of public sphere and the whole pop culture, which is very globalized. So you have themes, topics, memes circulating among groups across the world, but not necessarily among all the groups in one political context or in one national context. So that makes the situation much more difficult to create the space that you, Jason, had mentioned before.
Imagine what the conversation today would be like if Marine Le Pen had won. This would be, I think, a very different discussion. Again.
Can I just briefly bring up the most democratic sports game ever invented, baseball, at least according to the Americans. Until the early 1970s, Americans from all walks of life would sit in the same rows. Now you have a completely different situation where the upper class sits in isolated balconies, far removed from the hoi polloi. And that is a development that has shaped America over the past 50 or 60 years. It's a development from the Great Society, which was, in terms of percentages, the most robust welfare state ever known, to a market society which has, in contrast to most European countries, a rather weak welfare state. And that's a huge shift. It's not a kind of, the fate of America is not to have a welfare state. It's a sort of contingent development of the past 50 or 60 years that has obviously contributed greatly to the shrinking of a democratic public sphere, however defined. One can talk about schools, one can talk about universities, one can talk about the GI Bill. All of these great inventions of the Great Society have largely disappeared from the sort of social fabric of American life. And I think that is one of the underlying roots of the crisis of democracy. But there are more questions from the audience.
Well, thanks for these presentations. I would like to raise the issue to what extent possibly polarization might be the result of a certain way of conducting democratic politics in a different age as far as media and conversation is concerned. In my reading, a Deweyan conception of the public sphere was always centered around the notion of jointly conceiving of problems and solving these problems creatively, which meant that democratic politics is not limited to the nation state at the first. In that sense, I mean, one would assume that in an age of the Anthropocene and climate change, the kinds of problems which many of us should jointly want to solve at a global level would need to be addressed in a global context. But obviously, this is not the case. To the contrary, I mean, if you look at the US and increasingly also some of our European countries, we see that what you call the fragmentation of the public sphere, increasingly segments of society speaking different languages, different vocabularies, to use a Rortian term, and they cannot even think collectively what joint problems of the American society, of the German society, or a European society might actually be. Climate change. I mean, you just listened to last week what Trump has been saying when he traveled to California. You listen to someone on the left in American politics, and there seems almost nothing that unites them in terms of something of a collective agenda of common problems, common American or global problems that we might actually have to solve. And in that sense, I'm coming back to the question of education that was both raised and addressed. I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned Wittgenstein in the beginning as far as Lebensformen is concerned, and I was reminded of the quote in Wittgenstein's Philosophischen Untersuchungen that language training is not done by learning, but by training, Abrichtung in German. And I'm just wondering to what extent ways of training in that particular sense, Abrichtung, is happening in Blasen, in spheres which are not public in a Dewey's sense anymore, but it's the Fox News world, it's the MSNBC world, it's different worlds where people develop particular vocabularies that are incomprehensible for those on the other side, even though that they are speaking English or German. To that extent, I'm just wondering, the public sphere has been mentioned as a key concept for democratic politics, and obviously it is, but it seems that states, societies, national societies are collapsing internally so that polarization might just simply assume a reference point, the nation state, society, which is no longer there because it has been fragmented.
I completely agree, and this is my pet issue, climate change as a global thing. But there's one reservation I would, and here we can demonstrate the effects of the symmetry of the Hufeisen. What?
No, all good, all good.
I go on?
It's all good.
You said there is the Fox News world and there's CNN or whoever. This is the wrong description of what was happening. There is Fox News simply separating from the meaning of public sphere to a propaganda channel. This is not true for the liberal media in the US. Whatever you can put blame on them, their mistakes, etc., etc. It's not a symmetrical thing. There were two poles, leaving the public sphere into the echo chambers and bubbles. This is not true. There was just one actor, the right wing, who has left the public sphere and the public space. And I think this is what we have to make clear. Because otherwise we are in a complete dilemma, in a catch-22. So we are dealing with our own problems of the liberal media, which is always good, self-critique is perfect, but we do not reflect what's really going on. There is an attack, there's a grave attack against the public sphere by certain medias and not by all of them.
Yeah, I would like to take your comments on another perspective and just add three simple things. The first one will be, you mentioned the bubbles, right? In the social media, for example. The interesting point here is not only that you have a confirmation of what you have thought before, because the algorithms are bringing you what you already have researched for, but you have also a lack of accountability. The most of the time you don't know where this information is coming from, but it's enough to confirm what you're thinking. And that's a very problematic thing for democracy because you don't have any confrontation with diversity of thinking. The second point is there was reality TV mentioned in the panel before this panel. I think it's a very important part of media culture to think about this fluidity between the private and the public, the real and the fiction, and the politics and entertainment. And we are crossing these lines all the time. And the point is, I don't know how many people is still thinking about politics as we used to. But the risk here is, if you're following ethnographic studies and media studies, is that you develop an attitude that is not that brings you to the point that it's not important if it's fictional or real. the point is entertaining you. And if you have this attitude towards politics, then it becomes much more complicated to have a democratic debate. And this brings to this polarization issues within social media, because you have seen people saying, you have your truth, I have my truth. So you don't have to agree on some social and political facts and ways to see reality. You can dispute about facts, but you have to agree there are facts. If people are giving up that, it becomes very, very complicated to have a political debate, and that was we are seeing, especially towards the reception of what Donald Trump is doing. So his rhetoric is going to the point that, well, it doesn't matter what I said yesterday. Today I'm saying something different, and you are entertained. And the point is, we are getting used to that too. So the scandals now are not coming, not because Trump is not provoking them, but because we are tired. And I think that's also another risk for democracy.
Yeah. Christoph Wolf is my name. I think it's more than Fox News. Yeah, so I think the Murdoch imperium globally, I think, is another voice, and that monopolizes basically and directs right wing and basically thinking and creates this community. And it's as a matter of fact, I think we all agree that digitization has led to a fragmentation. And we also agree that I think that before 2016 and Brexit, that like Cambridge Analytica and the whole technology of micro-targeting and basically being very explicit to using Facebook. Yeah, so I think like the Facebooks and Googles play a big role, and I think this is the fact that they just halfway moved back, or Twitter. Yeah, so I think this comes very late in the whole debate. So I think this has played a huge role, and I mean you were saying what would have happened if Macron if Marine Le Pen had won the election in France. So I think people were really afraid after Brexit and Trump. How would you see this the state of preparation on this now in the fall of 2020? So I think the patterns are clear. The technologies are clear. There seems to be, I mean, there's more money behind these polarizing campaigns of basically getting to these supposedly underprivileged or left behind rural constituents and basically say, I mean, we know what you need, and I think and that there's no cross segment conversation. That's clear. But basically to target to those constituents and to mobilize them. What is your sense of the degree of mobilization now, since all this has been clear? There may be still a difference in economic means behind this. I think the Koch brothers are still there, and others basically and the evangelicals to funnel that campaign. So how would you see that? And obviously in the US, I mean, the city-rural divide is another one. I think there was a question: is there a joint US opinion? At Washington level, there isn't. Yeah, so currently there's no joint agenda. I mean, at this stage. But I mean, mayors are a force for more basically action, and actually a lot of states and cities actually have said, the agenda of Republicans, the government is not what we want to support. But how do you see in this whole polarization, fragmentation, how do you see the state of the learning curve and the state of mobilization in the different parts of the society in September 2020?
I mean, it's a great question. Unfortunately, this is something I think that's going to have to be answered after the fact. It's something to be concerned about. Yeah. I mean, so I think some of the questions that came out of 2016 were, I mean, I don't know that it's exactly settled. There were some studies about, even though there were these, significant campaigns online that spilled out into people's real lives, and voting, of course, is that the exposure to these types of campaigns was, statistically not insignificant, but not as perhaps influential as the narratives themselves suggested. So I think it's smart that the journalistic representations of external, involvement through social media, Cambridge Analytica, and various international, intelligence organizations, the concerns raised, I believe, help mobilize things like the formerly polluted intelligence agencies to try to investigate and prevent these. But the question, the answer is I don't really know. It's definitely something that we should worry about, but I don't know the impact or the effects of this on shaping a vote. It's right. The miracle today is that we still have undecided voters in the United States. So the idea is the choice between Biden and Trump. If, a Russian troll can sway somebody to make that decision, this is really problematic for, if it can sway, 3% of the population. We have bigger problems, right? Because there's just so much more information that available that, nonetheless, I think it's an important question, and the answer is I don't have a compelling answer to it yet. It's something that I would keep my eye on. I'm very worried. I think that it's a tipping point election. I'm very worried about what happens in this next election. To go back to this example, if we did have this domino effect of Brexit, the American vote, I think the Dutch voted, the Netherlands voted, France, and then Germany, and it was very close to being a very different world, and that's still possible, and we have to be vigilant and active. If I may just add one additional private communication to you, we talked about language games, which I understand is a conceptual metaphor, but I also want to express my appreciation and just recognize, that you're able to listen to me speak in English in Germany, and I'm just in awe of it, and thank you.
The American century is not yet over.
I still have my Learning German workbook that I'm working through slowly.
It's okay.
But thank you, I mean it earnestly. So.
Yeah, I would like to answer your question retrospectively, not about the United States in 2020, but about Eastern Europe in the last decade. So the problem was the left-liberal divide. So they couldn't find what Navalny would call a strategic vote against the Kaczynski brothers, against Orban. So they were split, and they had their disputes, and this was what true in 2016. Some of my friends said, I cannot vote Hillary Clinton. I said, do you know what you're saying? For this moment of 2016, I know why one should not vote Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, but must be clear whom to vote right now. But there are many people who are not clear. It's not just the very undemocratic electoral system in the United States that prevents the opposition to gain. It's simply our divides, and the divide is connected to this acceptance of the polarization thesis, because we're saying, okay, both are in a way responsible for what's going on. And I think this is over. And what it all comes down to is then the strategic vote of Navalny. I don't like Navalny at all, of the strategic vote of Navalny against Putin. If this doesn't happen, he will be there for another 20 years, and that's what. And the Trump family will create the dynasty. You can be sure. This is what is at stake, and the liberal left divide is one of the problems. And this is less about digital media, social media, etc. I know this is very important, but it has to do with the non-engagement of liberal and left and their common strategy to prevent further authoritarianism. I think this is the situation, even in Eastern Europe and maybe too in other European countries.
Did I overlook anybody's hand?
Just briefly, thank you again. One question to Professor Leggewie. I attended events and there are critics who wrote a lot and who are so outspoken and you admire them. You have followed their life over years. And they are so pessimistic, they say, oh, we have reached nothing. All is so terrible. Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What is the situation? And does Ludwig Börne oblige you to be so special and so on? Question very briefly for Dr. Mast. I read that you received the Choice Award. Just 3 secrets for excellent academic writing. Last point to Professor Diehl. You spoke about Brazil and there was only a recent revolution. My theory is there were many violent acts and so on also caused by indigenous people, and there were movements in the 60s and maybe also earlier by singers and so on. It's very well known. There were protestation and so on and so on. So I think there was violence, but it was not so much publicized. Yeah, that's the difference. Thank you.
Ludwig Börne, yes, he was in exile. Okay, Ludwig Börne was in exile in Paris. He had to leave this country. I'm hoping not to join this Börne. But he was, in a way, as a person, he was optimistic, and I can really follow him in this regard. In my deep heart, I'm deeply pessimistic, but in public, I'm always very optimistic about the chances we still have to beat them. But we have to be aware that they must be beaten. This is my point, and if this is, if you can follow this, I'm even more optimistic. Okay.
Jason.
That was very kind of you to bring this award to the attention as it goes out across the globe. I mean, it's interesting because I find writing very difficult. I mean, writing right and what's the word for being able to read?
The word for?
I mean, yeah, it's such a simple and obvious, right? Every day we think, and yet it is such a very difficult task. I mean, so what I think of it as like an exercise, so try to do it every day. Thinking, you asked for 3 tips. I'm not just, to be clear, I'm responding, right? I'm not. Also, yeah, I mean, there's a very different thinking. There's a very big difference between, just thinking brilliant ideas, which everybody is doing right now, and then trying to write them down. You can see that writing your ideas takes a lot of time and effort, and it's very different than just thinking. And a third one, wow. Oh, I would, is that edit, rewrite, edit, and do it again, that type of thing.
Yeah, the question on violence in Brazil. During the dictatorship, you had a lot of violence, especially coming from the military police and militias linked to the military police. But you also had some, not many, terrorist groups or guerrilla groups. What you didn't have was people attacking each other because of their political conviction. After you have a democratization process, you still have a lot of violence, but it's violence linked to class division. So the major division in Brazilian society always have been class division. What is happening now is a kind of polarization across all classes. And this polarization is for the first time manifest in political violence. And that is not a common thing that you have seen in Brazil. So people attacking each other in the internet, attacking each other in the bar because someone is wearing a T-shirt with the logo of the Workers' Party. These people were beaten, but by someone who could be his or her neighbor. So basically the political conviction is a break in the division that you had before by class separation because in your class you are protected, so the classist society works like that. And now this protection is gone because you have this fissure deep in the tissue of Brazilian society, and it's by political conviction.
Thank you very much. I'd like to close the panel with an anecdote from the US and an anecdote from Europe. The anecdote from the US is this: when Benjamin Franklin left the what was it, the Congress of Philadelphia, or the Convention of Philadelphia, where the American Constitution was written, he left the building, and the wife of the mayor of Philadelphia shouted at him, "Doctor, doctor, what is it that we have, a monarchy or a republic?" And Ben Franklin, and it's an anecdote, so it's not true, said, "A republic if we can keep it." So the whole point here is that the fate of democracy is not just a question of institutional arrangements, constitutional arrangements, but it's a question of sort of the fighting spirit, so to speak, that Claus Leggewie was bringing up. We have a responsibility as citizens of a democracy to make sure that democracy doesn't erode before our eyes. The anecdote from Europe is that two of the most interesting political scientists who've written about democracy in the second half of the 20th century are both from Norway, which is a rather tiny country, and their first name is in both cases Stein. Stein Rokkan in the 60s and 70s, and now Stein Ringen. Stein Ringen identified the erosion of the foundations of democracy as the most pressing problem that we are facing already in 2002 in a long piece that he published in the Times Literary Supplement. This was sort of went unnoticed because at the time no one was talking about the crisis of democracy yet, but now everyone is talking about it. But the point that Stein Ringen made is that the place in which that erosion is most problematic is our local spaces, cities, like the city of Bad Homburg. So the place where we can start rebuilding democratic spaces may in the end be a kind of cosmopolitan arena, maybe the nation state, but a good place to start for us all is the places that we actually live in, right? And engage and sort of contribute to a democratic culture and ethos in a local context. And with that in mind, one of the challenges that we are now facing is the fact that a pandemic has paralyzed public life at the very moment when we need public controversies more than ever. So whatever we do with COVID-19, let's make sure that we preserve as much public life and as much public spaces for these kinds of controversies and debates as possible. So thank you for your patience.